Will the DNC finally oust David Hogg as vice chair? Will Zohran Mamdani win New York City's mayoral election in the Democratic primary? And what did Bernie Sanders say on Andrew Schultz's Flagrant podcast? We're going to find out on this episode of Not Suitable for Democracy. Welcome to Not Suitable for Democracy. My name is Nick Hobby, and I'm your host. Today, we have a ton of topics to discuss. And to be quite frank, because the day ends in Y, that means it's another day of drama within the Democratic Party. I hate to say it like that, but that's exactly where we are right now in this moment, okay? So let me catch you up a little bit. So number one, David Hogg. For those who have been following along, David Hogg committed $20 million with his Leaders We Deserve PAC to challenge asleep-at-the-wheel incumbents within the Democratic Party, specifically within the House of Representatives. I totally support his effort. I think it's a great initiative because, number one, we need to be challenging our leaders to do better. Number two, they need to fight back harder against Trump. And three, they're accepting way too much money from special interests and money groups and corporations and lobbyists instead of, really being committed to supporting policies that benefit everyday Americans. So he has the right idea. Now, fast forward, what's been happening is that the latest news, one of the candidates who was originally running for vice chair had filed a complaint back in February, shortly after the election, right? So it already happened. The complaint was finally made its way to, I think, one of the committees on the DNC. They finally heard the case, and they said, oh, you know what? You're right. Your complaint is valid. So the complaint was the gender mandate within the DNC rules, right, would require members of different genders to be included in the running across subsequent rounds of voting. So, for instance, the two vice chairs now, Malcolm Kenyatta and David Hogg, they won the two spots as vice chairs with the majority of votes, as one does in a democracy. However, what the complaint is alleging is that because the DNC did not include the gender mandate in every round of voting, right? There are like several rounds. I think in the first round, right, it was included, but not in subsequent rounds. So because of that, the candidate who made the complaint felt disadvantaged, but also the DNC was not following their own rules, which then affected a different outcome within the party. So while it's important to follow the rules because we see a president who is not following the rules, I think that's valid to say, hey, let's reevaluate this and look at the rules. But let's be real. If this candidate wasn't getting a lot of support early on in the process, just by sheer vote numbers, then why should they be mandated to be a vice chair if the whole point of democracy is to build a coalition, right? You garner support through your leadership and experience. And to be frank, it sounds like that wasn't happening. So of course, this person is a black woman. So that meaning hey, she does deserve a seat at the table. But I think the way she's going about it is not very democratic, right? We want to make sure that everyone has a fair shot. Everyone can, voice their opinion, but then also vote to support the candidate they choose. And it sounds like she wasn't getting votes early on. So I don't think it makes sense to then put her as one of the final candidates at the end of the day. Whereas, other people in the Democratic Party probably disagree and they say, hey, because they weren't following the gender mandate rules, it should be changed. That's fine. That's what makes our democracy great because we're allowed to have that exchange. But in this case, right, the fact that this is now voiding, an election that happened months ago, I think it's, a little counterproductive. I don't think it necessarily sends a good message. And it is kind of identity politics, shaping how we view the DNC, but not necessarily in a good way. So that being said, now the ramifications are, because the election was voided, the candidates have to run again for their vice chair seat. Now, the thing that I find suspicious is why did it take the DNC so long to finally hear the complaint and finally, have her day in court or whatever, where it's coming to light now, right? When the DNC leadership had said, David Hogg, we don't like what you're doing. You need to step down or we're going to oust you. Couldn't have come at a better time, right? So basically now, the vice chair is going to have to redo the election. And then Malcolm Kenyatta, who is, openly gay black man, he made a comment in the media saying how David Hogg is lying about the narrative here, saying how, they voided the election to oust me. And while David Hogg knows that's not true, they didn't void it to oust him. But what they did do is that that luckily they had this complaint. They could have, ignored the complaint, really, because we know the DNC is notorious for, doing what they need to do to favor certain outcomes in certain elections, right? We saw it in 2016 with how they treated Bernie. We saw it how they operated in 2020. And now even most recently, 2024, changing the primary calendar to favor what would have been Joe Biden's primary. So yeah, it's not exactly a clean slate over there at the DNC. But then Malcolm Kenyatta, he was trying to correct the record and say, like, David knows that this isn't why they're going after him. It's disingenuous. And he called it out, calling it a telenovela. And like, sure, there's a lot of drama, and it's like, yeah, but calling it telenovela makes it that. So like, he could have just said, David isn't necessarily being clear about the timeline of events, but when you call it a telenovela in the media, that's how you make it a telenovela. And, leave it to the openly gay candidate to be like, hey, now, we don't like that. This is a telenovela. It's like, girl, you brought the drama to the party. So, like, just saying that's really how it's all playing out right now. So long story short, we're going to see how the DNC redoes the election. We're going to see if David Hogg, continues to run as vice chair or he steps down as like, you know what, I'm out. But at the end of the day, the optics of it all is it's so bad, horrible, extremely awful, and it gives me no faith in the Democratic Party that they will ever learn their lesson to understand that people want change, the system isn't working, and the status quo is only good for those who are benefiting from it, and it's honestly the liberal elites of the party. We need to challenge our incumbents and our leaders because they need to be doing a better job. So that's that on that. Now, secondly, we're actually going to fast forward to another national issue kind of related to that. Another case in point, Senator Cory Booker, the guy who recently broke the record in April for the longest Senate filibuster when he was protesting President Trump. It was great for optics, right? It was kind of a way to virtue signal to the Democratic Party base that, Democrats are taking on Trump. And, historically speaking, it was very momentous because in this case, Senator Cory Booker, black man from Newark, broke the longest filibuster record that was originally held by some racist who in 1957 had the longest record, who was protesting civil rights. So the fact that, all these years later, Booker not only surpassed him in the time he spent filibustering, but also like broke the record with a more powerful, historically momentous act, right, really does speak volumes. So like, I will give Cory Booker a lot of credit for that. However, most recently it became known that in a vote 51-45, Cory Booker was the only Democrat to support the nomination for Charles Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law's father. Okay, Jared Kushner, his dad, Charles. They just nominated him to be the ambassador of France. So it's weird how Cory Booker was the only Democrat to vote in favor of the nomination, especially when it's like, sure, well, he'll like spend literally over 25 hours protesting Trump in a Senate floor filibuster, but then vote for his nomination of Charles Kushner, who, by the way, not only was guilty of tax evasion, but also some shady business going on, political donations, right? He was charged fines. It was actually Governor Chris Christie, who was formerly a attorney general of New Jersey, who prosecuted the case. So very interesting how, between Trump and Christie running for president, and, Christie's guy who prosecuted Charles Kushner, and now Charles Kushner is going to be the ambassador of France. Wild history there, but like the fact that all that went on and Cory Booker still like voted to nominate the guy, probably not the best move, and kind of, doesn't really show a strong show of force to take on Trump and, resist the close relationship of the ambassadorship. That's just very weird. But again, liberal Democrats are going to liberal Democrats. So this is another example why we need to change the leadership. Okay, bear with me on this one. This one's about Biden. Okay, so former President Biden, he's been getting a lot of bad press lately throughout the month of May over his performance in the White House. Now, while he was president, we all saw how he was an older guy. He is the oldest president in our lifetime, in our nation's history. But also the fact that some of his behaviors, didn't sit well with Americans, right? We knew that he would stumble a lot of videos and a lot of talk about that. We knew he would stutter. He's had to stutter his whole life, which didn't help when you're trying to, be clear on your messaging and stay focused when giving very important speeches and interviews. So because of that, he came across not very polished, not very put together, and a little all over the place, especially with poor memory and being forgetful. So based on his own actions, like, as an old guy in the White House, like, he really did not live up to people's expectations. So because of that, there's been a lot of scrutiny about exactly how severe was his performance. And what we have been finding is that, Jake Tapper released this book, and in the book, it revealed that, should Biden have miraculously won the 2024 election, his team was considering putting Biden in a wheelchair for his second term. And of course, with that said, there was so much criticism around how much his team knew, when did they know it, and how much were they actually trying to hide or shield from the American public. Now, just like any presidency, the presidents lie, they gaslight, they tell little white lies to keep control, but at the end of the day, it can sometimes do more harm than good. And it breaks the trust between the government and the people. So a lot of talk between, how Biden was very forgetful, even one instance where George Clooney was throwing a huge fundraiser for Biden in June, only like days before his big flub of a debate performance. But at that fundraiser, Joe Biden didn't even know who George Clooney was. And for context, Joe Biden had known George Clooney since he was vice president under Obama, so for many years, but also worked on him with some other government issues. And lastly, that's not the first fundraiser George threw for Biden. So like Biden very much knew who George Clooney was, but at that event, didn't know the guy. So that should definitely raise some alarm bells when you need the president leading your country to remember people in his circle, people he's worked with, remember policy, remember ideas. And, Joe Biden brought it on himself. I hate to say it. So there's been so many issues of his decline and just him as an old guy. And like, give you another one real quick, where in 2023, Robert Hur had to interview Biden because he had certain documents in his possession that he shouldn't have, right? Trump was prosecuted for that, right? Trump had many documents that we saw, like, he took with him after he was president. They were, like, in the bathroom, right? Like, this really weird story about that. But point being is, like, Trump held onto the documents, and Trump held onto the documents, prosecuted. Biden held onto the documents, but was not prosecuted. And the key finding here is that Robert Hur, the guy who conducted the interview with Biden, like, hey, why'd you take those? He assessed that Biden was just a good guy, a good old guy with bad memory. That was the assessment of the president of the United States. Oh, he took those documents. It wasn't being nefarious. It wasn't because he was being sneaky. He was just an old guy who forgot. Would anyone want that to be their campaign slogan? Hey, vote for me. I'm the old guy who forgets. Like, it's really bad. So between all those stories and, a lot of the discussion around it, like, yeah, it wasn't looking good for Biden in terms of his just, poor performance as like an old guy in the White House. Now, just recently, it was on Friday when Biden, or at least the news had shared that Biden was diagnosed with an aggressive form of prostate cancer. Now, no one wants prostate cancer. It's, really disappointing, some of the reactions people have had to that news. But the point I want to make is that I find it very interesting how there's this lot of negative talk about Biden's legacy, about how he was, in decline in the White House. But then this news is shared on Friday, which, if we know the media cycle, right? I think just about every Trump firing in his first term took place on Friday, because we know the news cycle works, right? Like, you have Friday being like right before people check out for the weekend, right? I mean, the news still goes on, but like, it doesn't have the same impact of letting everybody know the story, because then once Monday rolls around, it's a fresh new news cycle, new things are happening, right? And with social media, right, news is shared very quickly. So like, once Friday happens, boop, most people know it. And by Monday, new stories drop, new things are shared, and it kind of erases, or, between the stack of news stories, it just gets lower in the pile. So with that said, I found it very convenient that this news story was shared on the heels of the discussion around Biden's poor performance in the White House. And I don't believe that Biden had like a doctor's appointment Friday morning and like just announced it to the world later that day. I doubt that's what happened. Like, like, personally, I believe, Biden and his team saw the negative press that was out there. They were really attacking his legacy. I mean, the man's, 82, and now that he's diagnosed with prostate cancer, like, he doesn't have much time, right? I think that's just fair to say. Doesn't have much time any way you slice or dice it. So because of that, his team was doing damage control, and they used that story of his cancer diagnosis to shift the narrative. Because then it wasn't about how old and forgetful he was. It was supposed to be, hey, don't attack this guy who's, don't punch him when he's already down. That's essentially what I think the point of the team releasing that story would be about. But it evolved, though, the story has evolved into, well, because he has such an aggressive form of cancer, when did he know he had the cancer? Because this type of cancer only gets so aggressive after years and years. It seems like he would have had this type of cancer while he was in the White House as president. But that's where we're at as a country. So you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. And like, honestly, it does not help our situation if the rules of our society are changing, where basic norms and that kind of thing, like, yes, I think they deserve to be reevaluated and changed, but I think when it comes to basic dignity for people and just basic, how we treat each other, yeah, it's not heading in a good direction. And that's exactly why there's so much drama going on, because we're just not treating people with respect anymore. And we see that more and more anywhere you look, especially in the media. So I'm just hoping that we treat each other with more respect, and we can definitely learn from our mistakes. And that's that on that. If you like what you hear and want to learn more, then make sure to subscribe to Not Suitable for Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. If you want to follow along or ask me any questions online, feel free to reach out on Instagram, and you can follow Not Suitable for Democracy at NSFD_pod. So next up, we're going to be going hyper-local now with New York City's mayoral primary. So the Democratic Party is having a primary in New York City to potentially elect the Democratic nominee for New York City's mayor. What we're seeing right now is that front-runner Andrew Cuomo is having a pretty commanding lead in the polls according to how voters will be supporting the mayoral candidates. Now, on top of that, one thing that's been very interesting to watch and fascinating is the ascendancy of Zoran Mamdani. He is a state assembly member in AD 36. He's been in office since 2020. And now that he's running to be, the executive of the nation's largest city, it's a pretty inspiring story just because his message is resonating with people. His platform is resonating with people that's rooted in, working class issues. The most fascinating thing about Zoran's campaign, if you look at a map of donations, right, that is a way to engage enthusiasm. Zoran has been crushing it in terms of enthusiasm and in terms of donations. Like, if anyone remembers that map of Bernie Sanders, his enthusiasm in the 2020 primary against all the other candidates, like Bernie's color was blue. I think there was a New York Times map where like every county or precinct in the country was supporting Bernie as the top donor in that precinct. And like, sure, like there was some in Minnesota for Klobuchar, there was some for Pete Buttigieg, and there was like some for Biden, but like majority, honestly, like it was overwhelmingly Bernie because there was a lot of support and people were giving their small grassroots dollars to him. Same with Zoran. He is getting a majority. He's getting like what? I think it was like 14,000 donors or something. Way more than any of the candidates in like every borough of the city. Like it's pretty wild to see that map, just seeing the enthusiasm on a grassroots level. And with that said, right, it shows that there is an alternate option than the front runner, right? Even I think Andrew Cuomo, who entered the race late, hasn't raised the same amount of money with the same number of donors. So Zoran is doing really well. Now, what I'll also say to that is that the key here is that this is a ranked choice election. Ranked choice meaning that New York City registered voters, specifically in this Democratic primary, will have the option to rank 5 candidates of their choice, up to 5. You can rank 1, you can rank 3, you can rank 4 or 5, whatever you choose. I would suggest you rank 5, especially if you don't want to see Andrew Cuomo as our next mayor. But here's the catch. This incentivizes candidates to play nice with each other, right? You don't want to be attacking or mudslinging, knowing that that could then hurt support if they're ranked on someone's ballot, right? You want to get their vote, earn their vote and their rank. So the better you campaign, the higher you can be ranked on someone's ballot, right? That's the goal. But it also makes them work together, right? If there's policies that they all support or certain candidates support, or if there's programs and successes that we've seen from their past experience, then yeah, we should be applauding that and supporting that. So in an interesting move, Zoran was the first candidate to not only stop asking for donations for himself a few weeks ago, because he already maxed out on matching funds. Again, he was the first candidate to do that. But now, as of just a few days ago, he's also the first candidate to start asking for donations for another candidate. He, on his Instagram, had suggested that his followers, supporters, donate to mayoral candidate Adrienne Adams. Adrienne Adams is currently the city council speaker, a very prestigious role in New York City's governing body, and she's done some great work, right? I will be ranking her on my ballot. I think she's definitely earned it. I think she would make a great mayor should she win the election. And honestly, like, I think it's so important to realize that as a strong Black woman, obviously it's very prominent of a role for her breaking the glass ceiling, but also like she has the experience and the credibility to do it. So like policies are fine. I think she definitely has leadership experience, and I think she would make a good mayor, right? End of the day, I'll be ranking her. Zoran is still my number 1, just to be clear. But because of his move to say, I am supporting another candidate, I want you to donate to her, why would he do that? In his reasoning in his video, he shared that he wants us to not only support other candidates, right? Because the idea of ranked choice voting isn't every man for himself, any man or woman or, non-binary person for himself. It's supposed to be for every, pretty much a united front to challenge or prevent Eric Adams' second term. And Andrew Cuomo is basically Eric Adams' second term, right? Like Andrew Cuomo is running on Eric Adams' similar policies. He even has his similar leadership style. And if you don't like Eric Adams, I don't know why anyone would like Cuomo. So I'm supporting Zoran, and I think having Adrian Adams as a potential candidate to take down Cuomo is very smart and very shrewd, and I love it. I love it a lot. And here's why. When you look at the map of who's supporting Andrew Cuomo, it's a lot of working class individuals, it's a lot of traditional moderate Democrats, and a lot of black Democrats. So why that's important, Adrian Adams. She is also trying to run and garner support from the same coalition. So if she can pull votes away from Andrew Cuomo from black moderate Democrats, voters over 45, then that will cut into Cuomo's lead, which Zoran strategically thought about to then potentially give him a leg up, not only to get more votes as ranked number one from his traditional base, but more importantly, to spread the breadth of his popularity and his visibility, right? More awareness, broader coalition. So if he's out there saying, hey, I support Adrian Adams, maybe some of those voters who are supporting Adrian Adams might rank Zoran number 2, number 3, 4, or 5. And that is a good strategy. That is definitely setting himself up for electoral success. And I think that gives him a really good advantage, which the other candidates just haven't been able to do as successfully. Now, I will say here, don't sleep on Brad Lander, okay? Brad Lander is our city's comptroller. I know most recently the biggest fight he's been working on is getting money back that the Trump administration had taken away from the city. We were already granted that money not only through Congress, but processed. And then I believe the Trump administration reversed the claim. So even though the money was already given to New York, Trump said, yoink, taking it back. And, we were like millions of dollars out the hole. It was actually really bad. And that's not Brad Lander's fault, but he's fighting the Trump administration. And I give him a lot of credit for trying to deal with that, mess. But Brad Lander has been really good. He's been a progressive leader, definitely has his own executive experience. The fact that he's the city's comptroller shows that he can win a citywide race. He has the experience. He has the credentials. I will also be ranking Brad Lander. I think it's very important to be ranking multiple candidates, especially at a time when the status quo is not working. Status Cuomo is not working. So that being said, highly recommend y'all, take a look at Adrian Adams. Take a look at Brad Lander. Definitely hope you rank Zoran number 1. If not, rank him 2, 3, 4, or 5. But point being is that this is how we're going to be shaping our electoral politics for the city of New York. Okay, I know that was a lot. The last thing I want to talk about is Bernie Sanders. Right, it's always a good time to talk about Bernie. So I'll just end it on this, where Bernie was on the Flagrant podcast, hosted by Andrew Schultz and a bunch of his bros. Basically, what's been happening, I saw the whole clip. It's like over an hour conversation. I personally think it was one of Bernie's best interviews. He just seemed so lax, seemed very comfortable. He was even pretty funny, not gonna lie. So just the idea that Bernie had like this really great sense of humor, like very reminiscent of like someone's, favorite grandpa or uncle, right? It's definitely like a good positive vibes that Bernie had in the conversation. But the best part is that he spoke in a way that anybody could understand, right? He was very direct. He was very just kind of like casual in how he would talk about politics, right? Really broke it down in a way that I think a lot of people could benefit from. Even his opening remarks, it's funny because the conversation started with him talking about like the Brooklyn Dodgers and how it was like some, rich guy who took him out to LA. Now they're the LA Dodgers. But the whole point is he's like, let's just take a step back and like, what is politics, right? It's about where we are as a country, how do we get here, and how do we move forward? Those are the three questions that everyone should be asking themselves about politics. And I think that's so great. That's the kind of thing we need to be doing. That's why I had this podcast right now, because we need to be telling people about, the issues that are facing our country. Like, listen, if you're watching this podcast right now, I really hope life is going well for you. But I know so many other people outside of my network, right? You just hear about it and see it. Like, things are not great for everyone. I'm fortunate I have my health and my happiness, but there's going to be a time when we don't have that, right? There's going to be a time when people are struggling to make ends meet. Bernie even brought up on the podcast, 60% of Americans currently are living paycheck to paycheck. I know what that's like. It's not easy to make decisions on your very next move because that could impact your survival. And that's what a lot of people are missing from the equation, right? People are struggling because we're in survival mode. And people in Congress, they make what, 176,000 in annual salary? Like, listen, that's great. They have access to the best quality care in terms of doctors. A lot of those corrupt folks even, are privy to insider trading and they have great portfolios. Like look at Nancy Pelosi, right? Or even Marjorie Taylor Greene with, getting insider info from Trump. All of that said, right? Like when so many people are struggling out there, 60% of America in a country of 330 million, that's like, oh my gosh, that's close to 200 million people that aren't doing so hot. Especially when children are living in poverty. It's really hard when people aren't willing to give folks like Bernie or AOC even a chance to really speak about, the pain and suffering that's going on. So I give Bernie a lot of credit for going on that podcast because everything he was saying was just so right and was so true. Where, he called out how the Democratic establishment is, not learning from their past mistakes. He even acknowledged VP Harris saying, Harris is a good friend of his, but she took advice from people who weren't looking out for her best interests, right? The consultants behind the scenes as advisors who are, losing elections, like that can really change people's lives for the worse. It's not right. It's not good. I really hope more people will see that, and it won't take a material experience to negatively impact their lives to learn from it, right? Like, if people were to not have health care or have someone they know deported who is a legal US resident or citizen taken away from them, or they work so hard in the education system, but the opportunities available don't adequately support their life, or they're in a climate disaster prone area where their lawmakers, state level, federal level, whatever, took away funding that could have saved someone's life from tornado, flood, you name it. It's not good. And I just hope more people learn that sooner than later. So, with all that said, I was really disappointed in the identity politics comments or backlash from the comments that Bernie made on that podcast. The message he was trying to convey was that, everyone's identity is valid, everyone's identity makes them special, but so many people who don't see it like that, right? They'll like make fun of it. Like, oh yeah, like, I'm gay, I'm special. It's like, yes, we know everyone's special. But what do you stand for? And that's the question Bernie was asking. Well, yeah, if you're black, you're Latino, you're gay, straight, whatever, it's like, well, what do you stand for? It was just so sad to see that people still aren't getting it, right? It's like, oh, well, it's more than that. He's just an old white man talking, and all the white bros were just listening in. They weren't challenging him, blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, there was a person of color in the room and on the podcast, so people completely just erased that extra voice. But then, too, it's like, if the whole point is that we're supposed to listen to each other and learn about identity politics and, improve our lives, right? Well, then then have that conversation with Bernie one-on-one. Because right now, the format is a podcast where, like, he's talking in a room with these or these podcast bros. So if his goal is to educate them and their listeners and their audience, right? Well, then that's who he's really speaking to. He's not speaking to someone who's, antagonistic because they prioritize identity politics way too much than anything else. Right? Probably a lot of 2016 Hillary Clinton supporters are not going to listen to Bernie because they still see him as the angry old white man who prevented her from winning, which wasn't necessarily the case. But again, these are the folks that are, going after Bernie, who's really trying really hard to, push our country in the direction it needs to go. Even here hyper-locally, like the Democratic Party infrastructure through establishment politics at the local level, I know what that's like. I know what the pushback is. So when I see David Hogg pushing back on the national level, I'm like, dude, I've had it just as bad here locally. So I feel you. I get it. I support what you're doing because all you got to do is ask the right questions and people get very upset. I can tell you that firsthand. People get very upset if you ask the right questions because it challenges their power. Even if you don't know any better, right? You're just like, hey, why is it happening like that? Or why is that person doing it like that, right? Like the most innocuous, you can ask the most innocuous questions to Democrats in leadership, especially if they're part of the establishment, if they're more moderate leaning. And they'll get like either very defensive or have like a very particular answer to like shut down the series of questions that you could be asking. Like it's pretty wild. I've lived it. I've experienced it. It's bonkers. So like when I see the pushback on Bernie from these people, it blows my mind. I'm like, have you organized in your community against these challenges? Have you run for leadership positions in these groups to know what it's like? And it's really hard to get people to understand that unless they've experienced the same thing. So a lot of people who are hating on Bernie, I'm like, unless you've been in my shoes, you just don't know. I mean, yeah, it's one thing to get upset over identity politics and how he's communicating it, but is that really the issue? Is that really where we need to be putting our eggs in that basket? Especially if they haven't experienced the challenges, the setbacks, the pushbacks, the, just the unfair tactics that have been so normalized in politics locally or nationally. I don't want to say it's the way it is because it doesn't have to be that way, but that's essentially where we're at. But just remember, like, big picture, our country has a lot of work to do. And just because Republicans or Democrats are in positions of power doesn't mean they're automatically good people, right? We need to challenge them and, encourage them to do better, especially if they're accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, from special interests, lobbyists, corporate groups, and all that jazz. So at the end of the day, whether it's David Hogg, Zoran, Bernie Sanders, just know I respect all three of them because they're doing the work, they're asking the right questions, and that is how we can move our country in a good direction. You might not agree with everything about them or their tactics or whatnot, but I strongly support all three of them because without them, we'd be way far worse. Just saying. And that's our show. Thank you so much for tuning in. I know we discussed so many different topics today, but hey, I really appreciate the support. Not Suitable for Democracy, the podcast has been an absolute joy creating this, and I hope you've been learning something new every time you watch an episode. So keep tuning in. We'll learn more together. And never forget, democracy is not suitable without you.